There's a bunch of stuff happening in the news that I'm sure a lot of you all have heard about, whether it was the Chevy Tahoe, where some folks at a dealership, grabbed a couple of developers and slapped them in front of the OpenAI API and built themselves a chatbot, and some clever folks on the internet quickly managed to convince it to sell them a brand new Chevy Tahoe for $1. So as everybody on this show may or may not know, LLMs really love to please. And anyone who's trying to get your bot to say things that it shouldn't kind of takes advantage of that vulnerability. The moral of the story is that it's not enough to just take some developers and throw them in front of the OpenAI API and then shove it in front of the world. It will do something, yes, but to be responsible, you really want to test your bots. You want to measure what they say. You want to validate that they're being ethical. You want to secure them. And, with all of the regulations coming down from the EU AI Act to, we've got regulations that NIST has put out. The Biden administration has been vocal on this. You want to make sure your bots actually follow the law. And that's both today and in the future.
The world changed when OpenAI released GPT-4 because it really grabbed the public consciousness, and everybody now is in a mad scramble, sort of surfing that wave to use these fascinating and wonderful tools to their advantage in business or some sort of really cool creative way. The natural next stage is, how are we going to talk about how effective these bots actually are? And can we corral them? And how do we measure when they're outside of the corral? Wandering through the forest today?
I think that the term that I keep hearing a lot is guardrails. Like, how do we put guardrails up around these bots? What are the contours of, what those guardrails actually look like? As we know, these models have bias. As we know, the data for the models might be coming from very public sources that have inherent biases. So I think part of it is just, if you have a project, knowing what the potential risks are.
Yeah, it's easy for us to think of sort of really nasty things that probably most people wouldn't want to have their bot discussing. Then there's the other level, is make sure that if you're having a chatbot that's designated to my company, which is a furniture store, that you represent the inventory that we have and not promise something that we don't have in your inventory, or certainly don't promise a value that we could sell a piece of furniture to that we do have at an incredibly low price that we would never support.
So I kind of break it down into like 5 sort of buckets of service that I think anyone that's going to help you build a reasonable, ethical bot will sort of hone in on. So one of them is just sort of like regulatory compliance and risk identification. Like, what are these? If anyone hasn't read these, maybe just shove them into an LLM and ask it questions. We have a bot like this that you can use. It's a combination of stuff. So a good chunk of it is really good hygiene stuff that you should do. So from a security standpoint, it's like, what's the data that you have? What potential biases are in that data? Then there's a whole bunch of stuff that's standard security stuff, like what kind of data are you collecting? How might it be vulnerable? So there's like a whole kind of hacking-y kind of dimension, which it looks a lot like traditional security protocols. Then there's stuff all around like monitoring and understanding. Like, what are you doing when you start talking about mitigation of these risks? So models have drift, where once you release them, they might change and start behaving differently in different contexts. So what are you doing to like kind of keep track and monitor that over time? So the next arena that I kind of chalk out is just efficacy testing. So this is like, hey, given that you have some prior dialogue, let's to stick with the Chevy Tahoe thing, somebody should have created a ground truth entry where they didn't intend it was for somebody to reprompt it and hijack the prompt. So that's an example of something that you would want to have covered in your efficacy testing. You would also want to have stuff covered about how well it's answering. So maybe, you have some sales guidelines. So don't immediately come out with the cost of a vehicle. Just ask them more questions. So that could all be like represented in, let's call it like perfect responses that are human validated, that you use every time your team releases a new set of prompts or a new variations on the bot. It runs through that battery of tests. So that's the second category. So risk identification, efficacy testing, and then related to efficacy testing is sort of the ground truth generation and enhancement. Like, how do you actually get those perfect responses? How do you do that in an efficient way and in a way that sort of hones in on the weaknesses of the bot or the areas that you're concerned about? And then there's this idea around knowledge-based editing. So as most folks know by now, like one of the easiest ways to keep these bots not commenting in areas they don't know about is to like force them to look it up in a corpus that you control. One of the things that security teams have done, for decades now is like red teaming, where, you really try to just kind of break the system out and get it to do some wrong stuff. A bunch of good guys trying to break the thing.
Yeah.
And even for the cases where if somebody listening has their own bots, and they just want to lean on us to like help them think through this testing and get an outside opinion, that's stuff that we do regularly.